Hi, I'm Mark Spagnolo, host of The Wood Whisperer at thewoodwhisperer.com. Now today we've got a real special treat for you. We're going to build a piece of furniture and we're going to use an absolute minimum in tooling to do it. Okay, this piece back here is a small entertainment center. Some of the great features, we've got these sliding doors. You can see the hole in the back, plenty of ventilation for heat exchange or air exchange to dissipate some of that heat from the electronics. We've got some nice shelves here in each unit in 3 compartments. You could sort of cover 2 sections at once, whichever 2 you want. And the whole piece is elevated on this, it's about a 3-inch base. Now, the other touch to this, although it's very simple, has a certain elegance to it and almost a throwback feel with the vertical grain. Just kind of reminds me of something that would be in someone's office back in the 70s. But at this point, I think it's been long enough that we can bring something like this back. Now, an interesting design element that I included was the tapered top and bottom, which is mimicked in the shelves. The shelves themselves have tapers mimicking the top and bottom trim, which I think is pretty cool. The other thing that we have is in the back. Let me show you that. Now in the back here, we could see 2 very important features. And this is the great thing about building custom furniture for yourself. If you think something should be there, put it there. Just because mass-produced furniture doesn't have these things doesn't mean we can't put them there, and that's the joy of making your own stuff. So the first thing is, a lot of times these units usually house a flat panel TV, and the idea is for it to be low profile and save space. So to me, it's really annoying when you actually have a piece of electronics on there and you can't push the entire unit up against the wall because of cords and a jumbled mess of wires or something in the back. So what I decided to do was to inset the back panel for the middle compartment like this, and this way you could put a surge protector or other various electronics or wires or anything that you might need back here and put it in this little cubby, and you could still push the entire unit right up against the wall. The other feature here is this gap. I basically split the back panels in half. So instead of putting a grommet or some type of a grill to let air exchange, what I've done is just removed part of the back panel so there's a free flowing amount of air that's going to go in and out and dissipate all that heat from the electronics. Also, the wires can just come right around and drop into this back area here. So again, a nice little feature, but one of those things that reminds us why it's great to build our own furniture. Now when I said a minimal amount of tooling, I wasn't kidding. This is pretty much it. We're going to use a circular saw to do most of our long rips and things and to cut the sheet goods down. We're going to use the router to make our dados. That's the primary joinery that we're going to use for the project. And of course the drill is just going to come in handy for various things that we need throughout the project. So really this is a can-do project with a very basic set of tools and some supplies. You can make a pretty nice piece of furniture. So I think it's time to get started. Let's get building this thing, and hopefully you'll be inspired to build this unit yourself or something like it. So let's get in there and cut some wood. So the first order of business is cutting down our big sheets of plywood. And that can be pretty tricky depending on the setup that you have in your shop. Now to keep things simple, I actually like to cut my plywood on the floor. Now it's not actually on the concrete. I have 3 pieces of wood under here, just 3 2x3s that span the length of the plywood and support it and bring it up off the ground. And what that allows me to do is to use my circular saw and make my cross cuts or my rips, whatever I need to do, to bring it down to a manageable size. And then, when I make the final cuts, I may do something a little bit different, and we'll get there. But for now, basically, all I need to do is take my cutting diagram, transfer those marks to the board, and I've got, in this particular piece, my top, my bottom, side 1 and side 2. So it's a pretty easy set of cuts, really not too much difficulty here. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab my straight edge, get the circular saw, and start by cross-cutting it right along here to separate the side pieces from the top and bottom pieces. Now before we make our first cut, we should probably talk a little bit about the tools that we're going to use to do it. First of all, let's look at the circular saw. It's pretty straightforward. What you want to look for is, well, first of all, if you're using the stock blade that came with it, you want to get rid of that thing. We're cutting plywood here, and plywood tends to tear out when you cut it, especially when you cross cut it. All those little fibers break off and it just becomes just not really a great looking cut. So you want to get a blade that has a really high tooth count. The more teeth, the smoother the cut. Okay, so as long as you have a decent amount of teeth in there, you shouldn't really have too much of a problem with tear out. Okay, the second thing we can look at are the straight edges. You have a lot of options. You can use something as simple as just a 2x4 that happens to be really straight. You can get a level, use that, just clamp it down on both sides before you make your cut. Or you can use something like this. This is a clamp and tool guide that spans across the sheet of plywood and has a built-in clamping mechanism. You pull the lever down and it tightens it up, and it's a nice, secure straight edge. It's really great, you know, really not too expensive either. Now, the thing that I'm going to use is the clamp and tool guide, but all these other options would work just as well. Now, when you go to make your cut, the first thing you're probably going to notice is that you have to figure out where this straight edge should go. We know the line that we want to cut at, you know, seems simple enough, but where do you put the straight edge? You can't put it right on the line because the blade is offset from the base by a few inches on this side and about 5 on this side. Okay, so you need to know what that distance is so you know where to set this straight edge. Now, on my saw, my blade is exactly 5 inches on this side of the blade. It's 5 inches to the end of the base. So if I want to make this cut, I've got to make sure that my straight edge is located 5 inches away from this line. And if I use a ruler to set it in the right place, I know I'm going to have a good cut. So keep that in mind throughout all of these procedures. That's something you're going to need to figure out for your saw so that you get it right each and every time. Now for the longer cuts like this one, the clamp and tool guide and even a level just isn't long enough to go this entire distance. So what I did was I went to the home store and I found a nice piece of pre-primed MDF that's probably used for some sort of trim, but happens to be a nice, relatively true straight edge. And I've held my straight edge against it just to make sure it's good. And I think it's going to work really well. So I just clamp it on both ends and run the saw straight across. Now the other thing to notice, when we're going with the grain and making the cut in this direction, it's not like cross-cutting where everything was completely supported. So what I recommend doing is either turning your supports, the 2x3s on the ground, turning them in the other orientation, 90 degrees, so that you have full support through the cut, or like I did here, just add another one so that both pieces are supported by two 2x3s, and this way, when you finish the cut, you don't want those plywood pieces turning into each other or falling because it could damage the plywood, or worse yet, it'll bind the blade and it'll kick back. So you never want to have that happen. So let's go ahead and make this cut. Now we're going to cut our pieces to final dimension. Now the thing that works in our favor here is the fact that a lot of the pieces have duplicates. For instance, there's a top and a bottom that are exactly the same. There's two sides that are the same, and also the middle dividers are the same. So if we cut them at the same time, it's going to make our lives a lot easier because we'll know that those two pieces are exactly identical. Makes everything that much easier. So what I like to do is I stack, for instance, I've got my two side pieces here. Obviously they're quite a bit oversized and we need to cut them down. But I stack them on top of each other. And what I'm looking for at this point, you see we've got a cut edge, we've got a factory edge. These are now cut corners, so we're not sure if those are 90 degrees. The factory corners, they might be 90 degrees. So what we want to look for is the best corner. And I take a nice big square to check it. And when I find the best corner, which I've already done, and it's this one here, okay, once I find the best corner, I try to even up both pieces so that the bottom is flush here and the side is flush here. And sometimes, you know, sometimes plywood is off, but in a lot of cases it's actually nice and straight and you might have a nice corner to work with. But if not, your cut edges might provide that 90-degree corner for you. So what I'm considering my good corner is right here. Okay, this is my good corner, 90 degrees, two straight edges. So what I need to do now, when I cut this, this sandwich panel to width and length, is make my cuts through both pieces, but make sure those lines are parallel to these. Okay, so there's a couple ways you could do it, but the way I'm going to do it is by, well, first let's take a measurement. Okay, your final dimension, and you make a mark. Then I get a nice, trusty, reliable square, and I'll extend that line all the way across. Now we know that line is parallel because we know that this edge is 90 degrees. It's square with the other edge. So using a nice trusty square like this will give you a good result. Okay? Now of course, we know that this line, although that's our cut line, that's not where we place our straight edge. Again, we would then measure, at least in the case of my saw, I'm going to measure 5 inches back and put a little line, and I'll do it at the top too. 5 inches back, put a line, and now I can grab my straight edge, place it right on the workpiece, on those 2 dots, clamp it down, and we can make our cut. And this time we go all the way through both pieces at the same time. And of course, you don't want anything to move, so you want to clamp both pieces down and clamp them to the work surface at the same time. Now I have both the top and bottom pieces here on my assembly table so I can sort of get a bird's eye view of what's going on. And what I'm going to do is transfer the lines from the plan to the workpiece itself so that I know exactly where I need to put my joinery. So let's talk about the joinery for a second. What we're going to use here is dados. Okay, dados are going to allow the vertical partitions to nest inside of a groove cut into the top and the bottom pieces. Okay, and with a lot of, decent amount of glue in there, it's a pretty secure joint. So plywood, whenever you create dados for plywood, you have a little bit of an issue because plywood is never exactly 3/4 of an inch thick. And if you use a 3/4 inch router bit to cut your dados, a lot of times it's going to be oversized and that panel is going to wobble in the dado. So fortunately, router bit companies make plywood-sized router bits. They're usually about 23/32 of an inch in width, and that's exactly what you need for most plywood. Now be sure when you get your bit to test it out on scrap and make sure that your plywood fits, because unfortunately, even though most plywood is around 23/32, I can't tell you how many times I've been bit in the butt by a piece of plywood that was either a little bit thicker or a little bit thinner. So just be aware of that. Now, the other thing that we need to discuss is how these layout lines work. Every time I draw up a plan or I get ready to do another project that involves creating something just like this, vertical partitions for a cabinet, let's say, you always run into an issue where you calculate the start of the dado and the stopping point of the dado. Because that dado is not exactly 3/4 of an inch, it really messes up the calculations if you have to add 23/32 here, 23/32 here, and God forbid, it might be some crazy odd number that's even worse than 23/32. So what I like to do is a little bit of a different approach. Instead of trying to figure out where the beginning and the end of that dado is, why don't we just worry about the center line of that dado? And that's exactly what we've included in the plan, are a diagram that shows you where the center line locations are. I don't care where it starts and stops, I just want to know where the middle is. So that's exactly what I have here on, this happens to be the underside of the top that I'm drawing on now. And the great thing is most routers have center line marks. And that tells you exactly where that router bit's center point is. So all I have to do is line up my router with the center line that I've drawn on my workpiece, and boom, I'm done. So the outside dados, I'm going to use an edge guide to do those because they're only an inch or so away from the edge. This will be nice and easy. For the inside ones, we're going to have to use probably the clamping tool straight edge or any type of straight edge to make those cuts. And we'll start with the outside and then we'll talk about the inside. All right, so we have one dado cut. Now I want to show you a couple very important things here. First of all, you are almost definitely going to see some tear out, especially when we're going across the grain like this. Right up on the corners, it just turns into this fuzzy little mess here. Now the thing is, that can be a problem if you don't remove it the right way. If you just basically come along and just try and sand it out of the corner and you're real aggressive with it, or even if you use a chisel to get rid of it, that might actually really cause some serious issues. The best way that I find to get rid of this stuff without actually damaging anything or creating an eyesore is to take a little bit of sandpaper, and I just have a random orbit sander pad, it's 220, and you want to sand with the grain. Okay, you're going to need to do that on both sides. But if you go with the grain, eventually those little pieces are just going to pop off. And what you're left with is a nice crisp corner. Okay, and the other thing that I wanted to show you, I'm never shy about showing my mistakes. Bottom line is, when you're trying to build a piece of furniture and you're the person running the camera and setting up all the shots, obviously my brain is in 10 different places at once. So it's very likely that I will make mistakes as I go through. And it's really important because those are mistakes that you could very well make too. And showing you how to fix them is really the key for all of us learning. Now, what I did was, as I was pushing the router through, I forgot that I'm supposed to stop. It's pretty much the most important part of this whole process, is stopping before you reach the end. Now here's the good thing. We haven't applied our trim yet, so the front of it's covered. You're never going to see it from the front. Unfortunately, the piece that I'm rounding right now is the underside of the top, which means really no matter what, you're never going to see it. So technically, even if you didn't repair this, probably wouldn't be the end of the world, but you should repair it just so that you get some practice with that method and you can see what viable ways there are to repair something like this. So let me show you exactly what I'm going to do. Okay, you can see right here, this little black mark, that represents the point that I was supposed to stop, and instead went all the way through. This is a common thing that may happen on any project, so it's good to know how you should fix it. I basically took a scrap piece of plywood from the previous cuts, and I cut a little chunk out that would be the exact width of this dado, and then I just very carefully sanded, like so, until I got it to be a nice snug fit. And really, as long as the grain's going in the same direction, it's a pretty good match. I'll put a little bit of glue in here. Make sure it's spread on the sides really nicely, the bottom as well. Put a little bit on the workpiece. And push it into place. Now I'll give that a couple hours to dry, and when I come back, a light sanding, even now you can see a light sanding will smooth it out and just kind of show you that it won't be all that bad. The good thing again is it's the underside of the top. You'll never see it. We'll just come back and trim this excess off with a flush cut saw, and our front trim piece will go in front of this. You'll never even know that this was here. Now to cut the center partition dados, very simple. We just line up our straight edge, use the router itself as a guide, and I'm going to eyeball the center line. Basically check it at one end, hold the straight edge, and check it at the other end, make your adjustment. Now you may need to go back and forth a couple times till it's perfect, but as soon as you get it just right, clamp it down, and you're ready to roll. Now, I'm still holding out hope that one day a router bit company is going to make a square router bit. But until then, we've got to fix issues like this. Now, where the vertical partition comes to the front of the bottom and the top pieces, it's rounded over because the bit is round. So we need to square that off. And the only way that I know to do that is with chisels. So the first thing I'm going to do is basically two different motions here. We've got the side that we need to clean out first, and then we're going to establish the front. Okay, so the reason we're doing it this way is because if we start trying to establish the front line here, there's a good possibility, because the grain is running this way, that the grain could split and continue on. So I don't really want to establish the front line until I've severed the fibers on the sides. Now, the widest chisel you have is really the way to go here, because you're going to reference off of the existing side that's there. Okay, just using the finger pressure here, you can sort of push in and establish a perfectly vertical position. So that's exactly what I do, but I tilt the chisel a little bit to the right like this, and I actually will hold it in and start chopping. So you just want to, at this point, go with the grain and chop that material out. Just keep working your way back until you're basically right up to your pencil line. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. So reference, give it the tilt, and just kind of pry it in. And that establishes a nice straight line. Come back with a smaller chisel, chop that away. Once you've gone as far as you can go and you're right up to your line, get a chisel that fits as closely as possible to the 3/4 inch width here. Put it right on your line or in front of your line, whatever your personal choice is. Mine is actually going to split the line. And I clean up. Usually you don't know how far exactly to go down, so I like to drive a chisel in this way just to loosen it up at the bottom. Make sure I have a nice flat bottom. There you go, nice and square.